8th grade, Algebra 1. This is Mrs. Sigley. This is video number 2. And in your online assignment, we're going to ask you 3 questions because it is multiple choice. You're not going to have to graph. You're not going to have to create a table of values, but you're going to take those advanced math classes that you need to know that. So again, multiple choice is we're going to ask you if it's a growth or it's a decay, what the range is, what's the y-intercept, and what's the asymptote. Those are the type of questions that you're going to get asked on the multiple choice assignment. So I'm going to start off with the very first one. And so in the very first one, my equation is y equals to 3 to the power of x. And I'm going to alter it a little bit, and I'm going to put it as y equals to 1 times 3 to the power of x plus 0. And the reason I did that is because then underneath, I'm going to put y equals to a times b to the power of x plus your asymptote. And asymptote is that new vocabulary word that we are using for exponential functions. It's a line that it never reaches or crosses, but it gets really, really, really close to. So in here, I could tell that my a value is 1 and my b value is 3. And so when I identify my b value being 3, well then I automatically know that it's greater than 1. So I know that this graph is going to be a growth graph. So I can answer that question here. What type of graph am I going to be having? A growth. I could already answer my asymptote. My asymptote is y equals to 0. And so I'm going to highlight my asymptote, and that's where I'm going to get really close to, but never touch or reach. But in order for me to find my y-intercept and range, I need a table of values. And the values that I recommend you using are -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. And that's so your graph doesn't get out of hand. And the very first one that I want is my y-intercept. And that's the only one I'm going to show you how to find. The others, you can use your calculator. So in here, I'm going to substitute wherever I see an x in my equation, I'm going to substitute it with 0. So y equals to 3 to the power of 0. And we know anything to the power of 0 is 1. So y equals to 1. So when my x is 0, my y is going to be 1. Then all you have to do is go to your calculator and substitute those values of x to get your y value. And I'll show you right now in your calculator how to find these. I'm not going to do 0. And so all you have to do is you go to alpha y equals, because you're talking about fractions. So I'm going to do the very first one. Okay, so I'm going to clear my calculator. Second plus 7, 1, 2, just so it can be nice and clear. And I'm going to do the very first one, and it's going to be 3 to the power of -2. Enter, and there's my value, and I'm going to round to the 10th place. So 1100ths or 0.11. And as you keep working it, the next one's going to be 0.33, 1, 3, and 9. Or you don't have to use your calculator because I told you in video number 1 that this is your factor. And the word factor means to multiply. So if you take your 0.11 and you multiply it by 3, you're going to get 0.33. You take that 0.33, you multiply by 3, you're going to get 1. You take that 1 and you multiply by 3, you're going to get 3. You take that 3 and you multiply by 3, and you're going to get 9. So this is the reason it's called exponential, because you're multiplying your change in value of y. So my y-intercept is 0, 1. And now I'm going to graph them. And so when I graph it, it's going to be -2.11, and I'm going to get really, really close. negative 1.33, as close as you can, so I'm just kind of figuring it there. 0, 1, and 1, 3, 2, 9. And so my exponential graph is going to look like this. And it's going to keep on going and going. And I'm going to get really close to it, but I kind of touched it, but you're not supposed to because the numbers get really close. And so my exponential growth is going to look like that. And so my range is going to be those y values that I'm going to take all the way up here. So in this case, I can't include 0 because I'm not supposed to touch it or cross it. So therefore, my range is going to be y is going to be greater than 0. My domain, if I take my graph and I flatten it out and I put it to the x-axis, well then my range is going to take all of the x values. So it's going to take my negatives, 0, and my positives. So we're going to do that little special symbol of the r, and it's going to be all real numbers. And that's the reason we're not going to ask you what the domain is, because your answer is always going to be all real numbers. So in your online assignment, it's going to ask you, is it a growth? What's the range? What's the y-intercept? Or what's the asymptote? So let me go to example number 2. So example number 2, my equation is y equals to 1/3 to the power of x. So to make it easier on you, I'm going to break it down. I'm going to change it to y equals to 1 times 1/3 to the power of x plus 0. So once again, y equals to a times b to the power of x plus the asymptote. And so in this case, again, we know that the a is 1. In this case, the b is 1/3. And we know that my asymptote is 0. So y equals to 0. My b is 1/3, which is a decimal or a fraction, less than 1. So I know that this is going to be a decay. So I can answer that question. What type of graph are you going to have? A decay. What's my y-intercept? I need my table of values. And the one that I'm mostly worried about is my y-intercept. So that means I'm going to put the x to 0. So I'm going to get my equation of y equals to 1/3 to the power of 0. And anything to the power of 0 is 1. So my y-intercept is 0, 1. Then, of course, you get your calculator and you figure out your other x values of -2, -1, 1, and 2. And so I've already done that. And so, therefore, it's 9, 3, 33 hundredths, and 11 hundredths. So, again, the factor is saying that it's 1/3. So if I multiply 9 times 1/3, I'm going to get 3. If I multiply 3 times 1/3, I'm going to get 1. If I multiply 1 times 1/3, I'm going to get 1/3, or in decimal, 33 hundredths. If I multiply 0.33 times 1/3, I'm going to get 11 hundredths. And so you could tell what the next y value is. So my range, I have to graph it in order for you to see it. So again, my asymptote is 0. And I cannot reach it or get close to it. So therefore, let me graph -2, 9, way up here. -1, 3. 0, 1. 1. And I'm starting to get really close to the asymptote, and I'm trying to avoid it, touching it. But it's hard to graph, but it's going to look something like this. And so that graph is a decay graph. So my range is going to be all of those values above 0, but not including 0. So y is going to be greater than 0, My domain, of course, is going to be all real numbers. So then I'm going to go to another example, but this example, shuffle my papers a little bit, sorry about that. I'm going to change it up a little bit. I have a negative. So that g of x is the same thing as y equals to negative, and I'm going to put a 1 there because that negative does not belong to that 2, times 2 to the power of x plus 0. So underneath, y equals to a times b to the power of 0 plus, of course, your asymptote. And so I already know right away that my asymptote is 0. Y equals to 0. And I know that this is a reflection because of that a being a negative. And so I also know that my b equals to 2, which means it's greater than 1. So therefore, this graph is going to be a growth graph. And I can answer that question. But I need my y-intercept. Again, I recommend you using -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. And the one I want to worry about is the y-intercept. So I'm going to put my x value to 0. So y equals to -1 times 2 to the power of 0. And this is where you might make your mistake. Only that is 1. So y equals to -1 times 1. So y equals to -1. So my y-intercept is 0, -1. And then you go back in and you substitute all of those x values into your calculator and you find out what they are, and you're going to get -0.25. You're going to get -0.5. You're going to get -2 for 1, and you're going to get -4. So I'm going to graph them really quick. -2.25 is about right here on my graph. -1.5 right here. 0, -1. 1, -2. And I couldn't create the graph for 2, so I'm not going to graph it. So my graph is going to look like this. It's still a growth, but it's a reflection. It's a reflection of the growth. So my range is going to be those y values below 0, but not including 0 because of the asymptote. So my range is going to be y is less than 0. And of course your range, which we're not going to ask you, it is going to be all real numbers. Now if you remember, your growth graph usually looks like this. But if it's a reflection, then it's going to flip and it's going to look like that. I'm going to do a DK one real quick. So again, y equals to -0.5 times 0.2 to the power of x plus 0. And the reason is so that way y equals to a times b to the power of x plus your asymptote. So one of the questions is, what's my asymptote? In this case, y equals to 0. The next one is going to be, what type of graph is it? Well, b equals to 0.2 or 2/10, which is less than 1. So it's going to be a decay. So that's another question I can answer. And then the y-intercept. So again, I recommend you using -2, -1, 0, 1, 2. The most important one that I'm going to ask you is the y-intercept. So put that x value to 0. So I'm going to do that really quick. So y equals to -0.5 times 0.2 to the power of 0. Again, don't make that mistake. Only this is 1. So y equals to -0.5 times 1, so y equals to negative 0.5. So my y-intercept is 0, negative 0.5. So I answered that question, which is going to be one of your multiple choice questions on your assignment. Then you get to use your calculator for the other x values, and I got negative 12.5, negative 2.5, negative 0.1, and negative 0.02. So again, your domain is all real numbers, not a multiple choice question, but my range. And so in my range, I'm going to graph it. Negative 12.5 is way down here, so I didn't have space for that. Negative 1, 2.5, so I'm going to graph it right here. 0.5, right there, negative 0.5. 1/10, which is pretty close. And then 2 is 200, so it's really close. So again, my asymptote is 0. Can't cross it or reach it, so my graph is going to look like this. So what's my range? My range is going to be all those numbers below 0, not including 0. So y is less than 0. So again, here's my decay. But since your a was a negative, so now when it flips, your graph is going to look like this. So again, in your online assignment, we're going to ask you if it's a growth or a decay. What's my range? What's my y-intercept? What's my asymptote? You're not going to graph because it is multiple choice. You're not going to create a table value because it's multiple choice. But you're going to be able to find your range from your asymptote and also based on your a value. So good luck. You only have 10 problems this time around. We cut it short. So we'll see you next week. Thank you.